If you've ever lived in a place with a homeowners association, you know there are rules. A lot of rules. But what happens when the very people in charge of those rules seem to be the ones breaking them? Well, we're going to dive into a pretty amazing case where one single homeowner, armed with just the law, took on their HOA board and completely flipped the script. It's a question that can give you a knot in your stomach, right? You pay your dues every month, you trust the board to handle the money, but then you see the numbers and they just don't add up. So the real question is, what can you actually do about it? Okay, let's get right into the thick of it. This isn't some made-up example. These are the actual numbers from a real case out of Scottsdale, Arizona. The Hilton Casitas HOA set aside a pretty reasonable $3,500 for legal fees. But what they actually spent? A whopping $9,250. That's not just a little bit over, it's more than double, and one homeowner was about to ask why. And just like that, the first shot was fired. A formal petition was filed, officially setting the stage for what would become a classic David versus Goliath showdown. So the guy who started all this, a homeowner named R.L. Whitmer, wasn't just nitpicking the finances. Nope, he was making a very serious claim, pointing the finger right at the HOA president, a Mrs. Karatz, and accusing her of personally misusing her power to get this spending pushed through. Now this is the real heart of his argument. It wasn't just that they overspent, it was how they did it. The key here is that phrase, without proper ratification. Basically, he was saying, hey, you can't just go and spend all this extra cash without getting approval from us, the homeowners. And he was convinced the law was on his side. Of course, there are always two sides to every story. So let's flip it around and look at the HOA's defense. How on earth did they justify spending almost 3 times their legal budget? And this is where things get really interesting. The HOA's primary defense? They blamed him. They basically argued that the only reason they blew through their budget was because Mr. Whitmer himself kept suing them, forcing them to spend a ton of money on lawyers just to keep up. So when the HOA president got on the stand, she had a few other explanations. First, get this, a computer crash had mysteriously wiped out all the board's records right after a key date. Then she said the decision to hire their lawyer wasn't made in a real meeting, but by an informal telephone vote. And finally, she just said, well, they had no idea they were going to get sued so much. So you've got 2 completely different stories. And this is the point where it stops being about he said, she said, and starts being about the one thing that isn't up for debate, what's written in black and white in the law. And this right here, this was the key that unlocked the whole case. It all came down to this one Arizona law. To put it simply, the law says that if an HOA board wants to change the budget, they have to get that change officially approved by the homeowners. The only way around that is if their own bylaws specifically say the board can do it on their own. And the law is super clear about the steps. The board has to send out a summary, set a meeting, and then, and this part is wild, the budget is automatically approved unless a majority of all homeowners votes to reject it. Think about that for a second. They didn't even need to get a yes vote. All they had to do was follow the procedure and give people a chance to say no. So, all the arguments were made, all the excuses were heard, and the law was crystal clear. The only thing left was for the judge to make the final call. In a civil case like this, the judge doesn't need to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. It's about the preponderance of the evidence, which is just a fancy way of saying which story is more likely true. And when you weigh it all, the missing records, that telephone vote, the scales of justice tipped, and they tipped hard. The judge found that the HOA had in fact failed to follow the law. And with that, it was over. Against the entire association, against their legal team, the single homeowner, Mr. Whitmer, won. So what were the actual consequences? First, the judge ordered the HOA from that point on to follow the law. No more excuses. Second, they had to pay Mr. Whitmer back for his $550 filing fee. And while the judge decided not to add any extra fines, the message was loud and clear. The rules matter, and you have to follow them. So, why are we talking about this one case? Why does it matter to you today? Because the lessons here are huge, and they apply to absolutely anyone living in a community run by a board, whether it's an HOA, a condo association, you name it. So what are the big takeaways? First, and this is the most important one, know your rights. Your state laws and your own community's rules are your most powerful tools. Read them. Second, document everything. The HOA's whole case crumbled because of that computer crash and their missing records. And finally, the most powerful lesson of all, one person really can make a difference. This entire story proves that a single, informed homeowner can hold a whole organization accountable. You know, when you boil it all down, this whole thing happened because one person took the time to read the rules and had the guts to demand that they be followed. And that really just leaves all of us with one last really important question to ask ourselves. Do you know the rules that govern your community?